Next from Springfield, we'll talk to several legislators as they give their reactions to Governor Rauner's FY 2016 budget address. This runs about 20 minutes.
Representative Elaine Neckrits, thanks for joining us. And just if you might give us your reaction to the governor's address.
Well, I think it's, it was the first step in the budget process. There will be a lot of negotiation with the House and the Senate and the governor before we have a final budget. I do have some very serious concerns about the pension component of this, not only from the fact that he is taking advantage of alleged savings before we would even have a court ruling on either the legislation the legislature passed or his proposal. And also, I just don't see how the math on his proposal works. The numbers don't make sense to me at all, and don't make sense to, frankly, any of the pension, the well-informed pension into people that I know. And so that's a very serious concern.
And we should say the Supreme Court is going to be hearing an argument on the pension reform bill that was passed last year. They'll be hearing that in March.
The date was set for March 11th.
March 11th, and then the decision, we don't know when that will come. We hope it comes prior to the end of May so that whatever that is can be incorporated into this year's budget. Yeah. We will find out. Beyond that, what is your overall reaction to the governor's address? I mean, as you mentioned, first of all, it's a Republican governor. He's trying to do it all with cuts versus new taxes. He's dealing with a Democratic legislature. How do you think his proposal, is it dead on arrival, and how do you see this being sorted out over the next several months?
Well, I think clearly there will be a negotiation between the executive and the legislative branches. I don't think it's dead on arrival. There are certainly parts of that we need to be considering. I would hope that the governor will see that we can do a more balanced approach to budget making so that we look to revenues and cuts. The legislature's done that in the past. In 4 of the last 5 years, we have passed balanced budgets. We've paid down the backlog of bills. We did it with a combination of revenue and spending cuts, and I think that's a pattern that served us well. We ought to be continuing to look in that direction. I can just tell you that one of the among the governor's proposals was that he would fully fund state parks. Now, I'm all for that, but when you're taking away funding for respite care for families with a developmentally disabled child, I just don't see why. Again, I think a more balanced approach is what we ought to be looking at.
If we might, let's go back to pensions for a minute. The governor was proposing for those who are still working to switch them on a forward-going basis to Tier 2. Which is a lower...
dramatically lower benefit, yes.
It's still a pension, not a 401k, but dramatically lower, which does apply to new hires.
Correct.
Your thoughts on that and whether you think that would be constitutional?
I long ago stopped making predictions about whether bills that we pass with regard to pensions would be constitutional. What I would say is that if the Senate Bill 1 is found to be unconstitutional, I don't see any way that the governor's proposal would be found to be constitutional. Because in Senate Bill 1, we were very careful not to change the check that someone would receive the day they retired. All those formulas remained in place, and that was a very conscious decision on the legislature's part. The governor is clearly changing that, and what I understand from the floor debate around the pension clause in the Constitution, that was what the framers of that particular amendment were focused on: is what is the formula that's used to calculate the benefit.
Let me throw this out just as an example, an overview because I want to draw a line of demarcation between this legislative session and past legislative sessions, not only because we have the first Republican governor in 12 years, but, and just to get your reaction to what I would say, I think that this year the legislature, on one hand, knows financially the state has got their back against the wall. They're willing to consider cuts that they never would have considered in the past. And at the same time, we have, as we were just alluding to, we have this whole huge expenditure of pensions that we are awaiting a decision by the Supreme Court that we may or may not get before the legislative session expires at the end of May. So isn't this just like one of the more unique legislative sessions, confounding in many ways, because you don't exactly know what you're going to be able to do on pensions. And at the same time, you have to do something on this budget because, as the governor alluded to, we have a big hole in the current year's budget that ends in June 30, and next year's budget is going to be $6 billion hole.
My view on the pension, on the question of whether the Supreme Court will rule in time for us to take advantage of any decision that they may make, is that we probably won't have time regardless before May 31st. They're arguing the case in the middle of March. The court, I would think, would take, I don't know, several weeks in order to be able to do that. And as I'm sure you recall from the whole pension discussion, every time we did something, it took us 2 or 3 weeks to get a real actuarial analysis. And we want to continue, I think, on that path to base our decisions on real numbers given to us by the actuaries for the pension systems. So I question whether or not by May 31st, almost regardless of when the court acts, whether we would be able to do that. So I think we may just be in a position where for another fiscal year, we're going to be bound by the old rules. We're going to make the pension payment as it is, and then take account of that in future years.
And not to keep you forever here, but I could certainly foresee, and see what you think. I mean, if the decision came down too late to act to get the budget, there could be a special session in the summer if then you knew constitutionally where you were, if people thought you could get something done. Now, I mean, if it's going to be something where it's going to be a months-long proposition, then obviously you're not going to do that.
Well, clearly pension reform has been a very controversial issue, and the likelihood, I think, that we could get a supermajority of Republicans and Democrats to support something on the basis of the court action, I think still remains fairly unlikely. So I would say that it probably would have to wait until next year sometime. And by next year, I mean 2016 sometime.
Last question, education. The governor wants to put money in K-12. On the other hand, he wants to take money out of the colleges. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think that having a balanced approach is the better way of handling that. I'm all for putting more money into education. We have made cuts to education in recent years, but it's because we were trying to balance all the competing demands. Our tuition at our universities is already higher than most places across the country, which is sending our students to other universities outside of the state. That's something we need to be very, very careful with, and a 31% cut to higher education would, I think, only cause us to drive that tuition rate even higher.
Representative Lane Eckrich, thank you.
Thanks, Terry.
Senator Christian Radogno, the Republican leader in the Senate, thanks for joining us. And what is your overall reaction to the governor's first budget address?
Well, I wasn't terribly surprised by anything he said. I think most people were anticipating sort of a reset budget, one that would make cuts and shrink government and re-examine how we've done business in the state, and that's exactly what we got.
What do you think of the governor is trying to balance the budget on the spending side, not seeking new revenues? What are your thoughts?
Well, the budget address, as you know, is meant to be given within the framework of the available revenues, and that's what he did. I mean, by law, he cannot promote any sort of revenue increase, and frankly, that's what the state needs right now. We had a revenue increase in the form of that 67% tax increase that the Democrats passed. We still didn't get the budget in balance, and so that is not a good approach. What the governor is suggesting is that we look at structural reforms first before we even give any thought to additional revenues, and I support that approach. It's too easy to go to revenue.
Are there any particular structural reforms that you would like to have enacted that would improve the state?
Well, I think a lot of the ones that he talked about need to be looked at, and many of them are far less draconian than they might sound like initially. When you put the context on them, it helps. So, for example, a 30% cut in higher education still leaves us the 4th highest state in terms of funding higher ed. It's only less than 6% of the total higher ed budgets, and they have $2.5 billion in foundation money. So when you look at the cut in that context, it's not nearly as severe as it might sound at first blush, and yet it gives great relief to allow us to provide other needed services.
And on such items as consolidation of government, is that something that you think has any traction in the legislature?
Well, it needs to have traction in the legislature. It's one of the biggest problems we have in this state. There's nobody that denies Illinois has an absurd number of local units of government, which cost taxpayers a lot of money. So to the extent that there is pressure downwards to do things more efficiently on a local level, I think that's a good thing.
One last question. Medicaid's a huge part, healthcare spending, but we had the SMART Act 2 years ago. They started to go through and see that a large number of people who were getting, on a sampling they did, Medicaid benefits weren't eligible. Is there any effort to get a new sampling or to look at that to where we can see at least the monies we're spending on Medicaid are actually being spent on people who are eligible for it?
Well, I do believe the governor proposed reinstating the eligibility check that we had going on that uncovered the huge amounts of people receiving Medicaid that weren't eligible. So that is certainly a part of the reform measures that he's proposed.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Mike Zaleski, what was your reaction to the governor's budget?
Yeah, it was a lot of tough news for those who want to see vital services protected in Illinois. I wasn't surprised. I think the governor has made it clear what his vision for the state of Illinois is. But we have to work together cooperatively to try to build some bridges between those visions and between the Democratic and the Republican vision. I look forward to helping do that.
Was there anything that he said that you were I shouldn't say very, but fond of as compared to being opposed to?
Yeah, I actually was fond of his work on his part about criminal justice reform. I think it's a budget issue we can all agree upon. Anything that reduces the burden on our prison population is a good thing.
And he was talking about some dire consequences in the near term, where the court reporters shutting down the court systems,
Prisons missing payroll.
Prison system payroll and others. How much does that resonate with the lawmakers to say, you know, we've got to fix some problems within a matter of weeks or we're going to have some real problems?
I think it's incumbent upon us to deal with something early in this session. I think it makes sense, and I'm hopefully that we can come up with a bill package in the near future.
And going forward, what about our revenue? Do you think from the Democratic side of the aisle, as you hear your fellows Democrats in the caucus, or is the approach still that you would want to have new revenues, and if so, from what kind of a source?
I think the Democratic caucus will have to come together on a unified strategy there. So I don't want to speak for my caucus members. I do think it's irresponsible not to at least consider revisiting our revenue code. A $6 billion hit is an awful tough pill to swallow. So we don't want to gouge the taxpayers, but we want to be respectful of them. But we need to be contemplative of any and all options.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Representative Fagenholtz, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. And what was your reaction to the governor's address?
You know, I want to be optimistic and keep a positive attitude. It was, there were moments where it did feel like I got sucker punched, especially on human services and on some of the Medicaid stuff. I think it's breathtaking, some of the cuts that he's proposing. And although I think his intent is possibly to save money, at the end of the day, I think that a lot of people will be shuttling right back into emergency rooms, and it's going to cost a fortune. He's basically shut down all mental health services in the state of Illinois, including some very important housing models that are heavily federally subsidized. I'm not sure I understand why he did that. So as time moves forward, hopefully we can help educate him about the relevance of some of these programs. But I do agree with him that we need to work together. I do agree that we need solutions. And I was a little disappointed that the issue of revenue seemed to elude him. Because I think that most people under the dome in all caucuses realize that we can no longer just cut ourselves out of this budget.
Speaker Madigan had a press conference in which he said the same thing. He didn't think you could cut your way to a balanced budget. Is there any kind of a revenue if there's been a variety of things proposed. One would be to go back to the 5% income tax. One would be that we thought we were going to hear more of to spread the sales tax to services, since in our current economy there's any number of the majority, in fact, of economic activity is services, not manufacturing.
Correct.
Do you feel from just conversations you've had with either the Republicans or Democrats in the House that one of those approaches on revenue is more favored?
I think the establishment of a new tax is a little complicated around here, even if it does make the most sense, and we do live in a service economy. I mean, I think on paper it makes the most sense. I just think implementation and collection is a little complicated, and you have all sorts of special interest running to the Capitol saying, don't cut the barbers, don't cut the manicurists, don't do this, don't do that. And it ultimately becomes the law of diminishing returns. I think that looking at other sources of revenue or some other things like the Civic Federation actually come out with some very, very interesting proposals. But at the end of the day, everything is on the table. I think Speaker Madigan also said in the press conference that nothing in problem solving should be dismissed here. Everything is on the table, and that we should all work together toward a solution.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
2-1. Representative John Bradley, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. What overall was your reaction to the governor's budget address?
Well, it was certainly different than anything I've heard before in terms of budget addresses, and I'm sure it will be very controversial. We'll be looking for the legislation to be put forward by the governor's office backing up these ideas or these notions that he put forward with regards to, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, tax reform, pensions, the budget, etc. So, he's had several weeks to work on this, and he's had a couple of months to work on this since he was elected, and we just got it, and there really wasn't a lot of, if any, kind of briefing in terms of substantive prior to the speech, and so take a little time to digest it, reflect upon it, look for opportunities to work together in a bipartisan manner, and disagree where we can.
I personally was surprised it was as short as it was and that there wasn't a little bit more details, which you just kind of alluded to. So it will take some time, as you say, to find out what are the details in the budget that's actually being released as we speak here. One of the ideas was to be taking more money out of higher education. You're down in the area of SIU in Carbondale. What are your thoughts on that and the impact it would have on a school like SIU?
Well, I certainly think that SIU has two issues that we have to deal with in this spring session. Number one would be the funding and making sure the funding levels are sufficient for the university. And secondly, there's an ongoing attempt to split the universities and to make Edwardsville and Carbondale different campuses, and we have to continue to fight that. Certainly for an administration that's concerned about efficiencies and getting the most use of tax dollars, splitting the universities is not an efficient use of those resources.
All right, we know you got to go, so we'll let you go, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.